Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hardworking Americans and their families? You will. This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefit in benefit plan. Now prepare to learn, plan, save, and protect with the Phia Group.
Welcome to another episode of our Empowering Plans podcast.
Woohoo!
I am excited today. I am Jen McCormick, and with me I have John Jablon here today, our expert in this area. So we have had quite a few issues come to our attention as we are, believe it or not, filing the fourth quarter of 2022.
Wow.
I know, it's hard to believe. Here we are. And there have been lots of issues and concerns and questions and recommendations that people are looking for as they're hoping to get through the renewal period, answer these questions as seamlessly as possible. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to dig in a little bit deeper as it relates to some of the newer Consolidated Appropriation Act issues as relates specifically to the No Surprises Act. It is a touchy topic, it's a nuanced topic, it's an exciting topic. So hopefully today we can get through some bulleted topics and issues that we have found have come up again and again and really nail down and give some good information and guidance so everybody is prepared and ready for 2023. Funny to say, right? 2023.
I mean, after 2020 was 3 years long, 2023 doesn't seem so weird.
That is true.
I get that. And, you know, for what it's worth, Jen and I are actually sitting here in the same room together recording this podcast, which is weird, let me tell you. And she's very animated. So when she's talking, she's all over the place. She's looking at me. I'm like, geez, this is awkward. But no, it's great. It's nice to be back in the office. You know, we've got most of our staff back here trying to get back to normal, which we've been doing now for a couple of months. And it's been great, you know, seeing people in real life. It's better than I thought it was going to be. You know, we did 2 years remote and I kind of got used to that, but it's really good to be back. So I'm happy to be here in real life.
Without a screen, there's no screen between
well,
us.
There's a screen next to us, but there's no screen between us.
But
yeah, absolutely. And with respect to actual benefits, you know, the topic that we're trying to actually cover today, a lot of people have told us that it seems like the Consolidated Appropriations Act and the No Surprises Act are some of the most sweeping laws in this industry since the Affordable Care Act, which, I mean, that shook things up to a huge degree, and this is no different. And they touch on different subjects. You know, this concerns a lot of payment obligations and transparency. And the ACA did just a whole mess of stuff. Don't get me wrong. The ACA was very, very sweeping and disruptive. But the No Surprises Act, I don't know if it's the timing or the scope of what it's actually aiming to regulate, but it seems like the No Surprises Act is shaking things up, in my opinion, even more than the ACA did. I mean, that seemed more like routine stuff that was at least manageable, whereas the No Surprises Act, there's still just so many unknowns and TPAs and brokers freaking out because they just have no idea where to even start with compliance. And it's been really fun, Jen, I'll tell you.
Yeah, and you know what? And it's hard to believe for some of these provisions in their implementation, we're coming close on a year of actual effectiveness for these. So a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today, there has been this phased in approach and some delays and some stops and some starts and then some stops again for how and what to do, because it is so confusing and it is an area that has a very large impact on a lot of different players. So it is important to really understand where we are and to share some of our experience with the questions we have. So we have a couple of topics to talk about: the broker compensation law, what that means, some of our thoughts about that, about the ID cards. Believe it or not, this is still a question we get in regionalness and what makes sense and how to do this. Some questions about what to do for a plan that doesn't have a network. What are the considerations when it comes to the No Surprises Act? And generally, what are the obligations of the different entities that are involved, particularly the third-party administrators? What must they do in this process? So those are the main topics that we're hoping to cover today. Let's kick it off by talking about the broker compensation law. So this is something that has come up again because oftentimes people like to have a process and understand the what. And here, the what and the how is not so clear. We know that transparency is the goal, but what that looks like and how to do it is to be transparent. You know, and as far as the best advice on what you need to share, it's hard to give somebody a template without knowing exactly the what and the how it's being communicated. Do you have an idea, John, on some of the questions that you've received and the best guidance that we can offer people so that they are knowing what to share?
Yeah, absolutely. The number one thing that I want to bring up is that even though it's colloquially known as the broker compensation law, it's not just for brokers. Maybe brokers are impacted more than some other entities, but it applies to anyone who provides services to a plan. And that does include TPAs. We get that question constantly. TPAs say, well, it's for brokers, right? No, it is for brokers, but it's also for you. You provide services to the plan and you charge fees for it. Hopefully, you deserve the fees anyway. You need to disclose those fees. And that's not part of the No Surprises Act. That's part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act. But effectively, and of course, this is boiling it down considerably, but basically what the law says is whatever you're charging the plan for, you've got to disclose it. You have to be transparent. There are some nuances, there's lots of details, but ultimately at the end of the day, Congress doesn't assume that you always know the exact dollar amount that you're going to be charging. When they say you have to disclose your fees, the question often comes up, well, what if our fees are a percentage of savings or a percentage of something else, or maybe a contingency to be defined later? Well, that's okay. Congress never meant to say that you can't do that, but you have to explain it. You can't just say, there might be fees in the future. You've got to explain what those fees are, how they could be calculated, how you plan on, even planning on figuring them out, however tenuous it may be, you've got to do everything you can to at least try to explain your fees. And if you don't, there can be ERISA implications in the arena of prohibited transactions, which is, I know for a lot of people, those words strike terror in your hearts. It's really just a fancy way of saying certain contracts you're not allowed to sign. And in particular, in this arena, it means contracts you're not allowed to sign unless you know the fees, unless the fees are disclosed. So one question we get all the time, and I touched on this before, but is, what if our fees are a percentage of savings? How do we articulate those fees? Very, very simple. Describe it. What is the savings? How do you figure out the savings? Usually the savings is just whatever money you could have spent that you ended up not spending because of us. And the percentage is probably just a number. Just describe the fees. It seems really daunting, but at its core, Congress intended it to be very, very simple. And as usual, what the Department of Labor has said is that if you don't know exactly how to comply, or if the letter of the law doesn't seem to apply to your particular situation, you're supposed to use what they call a good faith, reasonable interpretation.
Oh,
seems pretty intuitive,
yeah.
right? I mean, obviously it's easier said than done, but as long as what you're saying is in good faith and it's reasonable, you should be okay. And of course the Phia Group is standing by. We can help you with your disclosures, whatever your fees are. If you're worried about how to describe them, let us know and we might be able to help. But, Jen, I know that we've got a lot of clients who do really wonky stuff with fees. And, I'm just wondering, at what point do we expect the DOL to do a crackdown on this? They're looking into the NQTL arena more than ever. More than ever. It's really only been a year since they vowed to increase this. But I don't know about you, but I feel like this is a pretty important part and we could see a lot of audits based on it.
Yeah, so that's the thing. The peak that we have seen so far really has been in the NQTL space. But as part of that, they're using the opportunity for a complaint or a question from a consumer or from a member that's being escalated from the regional EBSA office to the DOL, to use that as an opportunity to investigate to see if there is something deeper. And as you know, when it comes to the NQTLs, some of the focus areas are related to how certain claims are being priced in network versus out of network, which you can see some parallels here. If this is something that they are truly investigating and interested in, and how certain arrangements are being set up for the network or for the out of network, and making sure that information is being provided to the members, that could give us a peek as to what's coming next. Not to mention all of the 401k fiduciary cases that we have seen in recent years too. This is an important topic. So being prepared and understanding that creativity in this space is welcomed, as long as there is a clear way to reasonably describe how that creativity is being carried out, so that there's no confusion. You can read the words on the page and understand how the fee is being derived. That's what they're looking for, not a setup of the best KPIs for how every broker is managing their business, or broker in the sense of a broader term of who actually is providing the services. They just want the transparency, right?
Yeah, I mean, we can view this law as sort of a consumer protection law, kind of like the NQTLs, where the individual plan participant is the consumer. Well, here, the vendor is the service provider and the plan is the consumer. It's all kind of that same pattern where the plan needs to be able to decide whether a fee is reasonable. And that's a really interesting topic because what the heck is a reasonable fee? I don't know, is a 15% fee reasonable for a given service? What if another vendor charges 20%? Is the 20% one inherently unreasonable? No, of course not. Reasonableness, it's in the eye of the beholder, let's say, right? And so the fees don't necessarily need to be reasonable because objective reasonability doesn't exist, but the plan needs to be given enough information to determine whether it thinks the fees are reasonable.
So you mean they have a duty to prudently manage the assets of the plan. In order to do that, they need to understand how the fees are reasonably being derived?
Well put.
Interesting.
Yeah. If you don't know what you're being charged or why, it's hard to decide if it's reasonable.
So, and on that topic of being reasonable and making sure that we have the consumer protections in place, let's move on to the ID cards.
Oh yeah, really fun topic. And this question I got once and I said, really interesting. Then I got it again and again and again and again, and it kept coming in. And it appears to be an ongoing issue, and we'd like to touch on it here. The question is, with multiple plan options within the same plan, right? Multiple out-of-pockets, multiple deductibles, like a buy-up plan type thing, can we put it all on the same card? Or do we have to actually tailor each card to each individual plan participant? Because that's a freaking nightmare. So the answer generally is that the regs don't say one way or the other.
So it depends?
It depends, sure. It depends on whether you're adequately describing what you're doing, just like with the so-called broker compensation laws. But ultimately, remember, consumer protection. If the consumer gets an ID card, the consumer meaning the plan participant, if the plan participant gets an ID card and it's got 3 different deductibles and 3 different out-of-pockets, can we reasonably expect the plan participant to know which one applies to him or her?
Good question.
Yeah, maybe, right? With the right level of education and with constant reminders, maybe. Maybe is probably the best we can do here because we are talking about the average layman plan participant. They don't know a whole lot about insurance. They're not expected to. They pay you money, you give them coverage, whatever their deductible is, they usually don't even really realize it until they see it written on an EOB. But if you give a card that's got 3 different numbers and you say, well, whichever one is yours, use that one, often they're not going to know. And forget about employees directly. How about dependents, right? If a dependent spouse or dependent child has a card, that dependent is even less likely to know which one actually applies to that person. So just like with the other law, the government said, even if the letter of the law does not specifically apply to you, if you can't literally follow this rule, you've got to do whatever is reasonable. You've got to describe what you're doing, and you have to describe it clearly. You have to describe it in a way that doesn't confuse consumers, a way that accomplishes the goals of the law. And the law is transparency.
Right.
So on the topic of, describing what you say you're doing, Jen, I know you've got a lot of thoughts about this. Let's hear them.
Yeah, the other parallel here too is, do you remember the SBC rule when that first came out? And there were all kinds of questions about this separate document that needed to be provided on top of the plan document.
Sure.
So I have to give the PD, the SBD, I have to issue these SMMs and amendments every single time. And now you're telling me I have to issue the SBC. And I'm like, yes.
It's almost like it's a lot of work.
It's like, yeah, it is
weird,
a lot of work,
right.
But the SBC was required for every single plan option. And one of the reasons why they decided that needed to be done for every plan option was to create that transparency. It was intended to help people to choose and purchase insurance in a way that was easy for them to understand, whether this is the high deductible plan, the PPO plan, or the HMO plan. They had a single SBC that they could look to, and they understood which one would apply for the benefits they would receive. And the same analogy applies here, is that you want to make sure that when people are choosing, accessing their benefits, they know what they're purchasing. And I think that's key for us to understand. And on that topic, and understanding which plan option would be the most appropriate for us, let's dig into the network, non-network discussion as it relates to the No Surprises Act.
All right, yeah, fun topic. And in the interest of time, we will go over it somewhat quickly. And, for any of this, and of course, there are just so many more topics that we could bring up regarding the No Surprises Act and Consolidated Appropriations Act. Tune into future podcasts and our free webinars. I mean, we talk about all this stuff just constantly. But we get a lot of questions regarding what happens if our plan uses reference-based pricing in terms of the requirement to put in language about networks and stuff like that? In other words, if we don't use a network, do we still have to talk about networks or participating providers? And as a general best practice, we do not recommend just leaving out certain parts of the No Surprises Act when you're writing in your plan language. We don't recommend just saying, this doesn't apply to us, we're not even going to include it in here. The main reason for that is because even reference-based pricing plans often sign contracts. And frankly, a lot of RBP plans and vendors have found that the only really, really good way to do RBP is to have some contracts sometimes. I mean, if you can enter a super narrow network with a very small group of providers that have given you really great rates, it would be crazy not to, probably, right? I mean, if a provider is willing to accept a low percentage of Medicare or whatever metric you choose, you got to jump on that. And if you don't have language in the plan that actually accounts for those contracts per the No Surprises Act, you're going to be in some trouble. So we don't recommend just ignoring that language. But one thing you could do is when the No Surprises Act talks about networks and participating providers, what they're really talking about is contracted providers. So one thing that we've advised in the past is that if you really want to, you can change references to networks to contracted providers or something like that. There are ways to finagle the language to keep it absolutely accurate, but still accomplish the plan's goals and tailor that language to exactly what the plan's doing. And again, this goes back to that guidance where if you cannot follow the letter of the law, if it doesn't make sense to do a certain thing exactly as the law says, just make sure you accomplish the intent of the law using a good faith, reasonable interpretation. And there's a lot of possible ways to interpret all these provisions, but ultimately, it's going to just depend on the exact structure of the plan. Some plans are, let's say, more RBP than others, right? So even the most RBP of RBP plans, no contracted providers, no plans to have any contracted providers in the future, we still have a hard time recommending getting rid of contracted provider language because you really just never know.
Yeah, and the thing about this with the No Surprises Act is that there are changes to a plan's language that need to be addressed. In the old days, the pre-NSA days, we had this thing called the greatest of three rule. And that was how we governed how payment would be made in certain categories. And this was a similar discussion that we had where the laundry list of the greatest of three, there were not always three applicable parameters that would apply for a particular plan, but that didn't mean that we only listed the greatest of one within the plan. And the same analogy can be said here. It's just, this is a law that the plans are subject to. Whether or not all of the parameters would always be applicable, it's going to be a case-by-case analysis to decide what to do. A lot going on here, a lot for us to consider. And in closing, I think it's important that we just wrap briefly and talk about the obligations that the administrator has as far as this process, because this is a lot. It's a lot for us to consider. I know that we talk fast. We're excited about this since this is such an important topic, and a lot of this needs to be addressed not only for this year, but for 2023 and beyond as it stands currently at this point in time. So what is a TPA to do? What is their required obligation when it comes to helping plans and brokers and those involved in the industry when it comes to the NSA?
Complicated topic. I mean, for one thing, it's important to remember that the obligations in the No Surprises Act are really on the plan. They're not on the TPA. Practically speaking, though, I think we all know what's really going on, right? I mean, obviously, health plans are going to have to lean on their TPAs. They're brokers too, of course, but the TPAs have what is usually considered to be the most direct access to the data and, the easiest way to, I hate to use this word, but the easiest way to control the documents that the plan is producing and things like that. So practically speaking, TPAs have found it necessary to at least provide some compliance assistance, but you don't have to. It's all a contractual matter. It's all a business decision. We've seen ASAs that run the gamut from, TPAs that specifically say, we will not help you with any No Surprises Act compliance. You're going to have to find a vendor, to, we will take care of everything. Don't worry about it. We've got vendors. We've got resources. It's on us. We've seen it all. And in the former, right, where a plan is basically required to do its own compliance, not unexpectedly, the plan kind of sits there and shrugs and says, where do we even begin? You're not going to help us. How do we do this? Who do we call? If you can even just give us a phone number for where to start, that would be great. It's really tough to know as a TPA what exactly you can do, what you want to do, what you feel comfortable doing. Hopefully, as these requirements progress and as you have to dip your toes in the water more and more, whether because you want to or whether it's just out of necessity and of keeping clients, hopefully you'll get more comfortable with it. Hopefully your groups will feel more comfortable with their own compliance, because if there's a lot of tension in the compliance arena, that can really strain a relationship between a TPA and plan.
So in closing, what you're saying is never leave it as a surprise for who's responsible for what when it comes to all of these obligations that are for the plan versus the administrator versus contractually or not contractually out in some sort of document or not in some document in the universe generally. Be prepared.
Yeah, I mean, it's called the No Surprises Act.
Oh, jeez.
Right? Oh, sorry. Sorry, that was bad. But yes, no, absolutely. Be prepared, be clear, be transparent. Really, if I could boil down the No Surprises Act and Consolidated Appropriations Act into one word, it would be transparency. I can think of a few other words I'd like to use, but transparency is the one that I'm going to do right now.
So in closing, thank you so much, John. This was an exciting opportunity for us to talk face to face and to have this discussion. So thank you again for joining us today for another episode of our Empowering Plans podcast.
We'll see you soon. Thanks.